This is Nanoscape. I'm Seth Zimmerman.
And I'm Erin Spain.
On this show, we venture into the frontier of nanotechnology
With experts in the field who are turning the science of small into the next industrial revolution.
This podcast is brought to you by the International Institute for Nanotechnology at Northwestern University. Our guest today, Dr. Ludmilla Aristilde, is an expert in environmental chemistry, environmental biochemistry, and bioengineering, but at the heart of it all is nanoscience.
She's a professor of civil and environmental engineering, as well as chemical and biological engineering and earth and planetary sciences here at Northwestern University. We are thrilled to welcome her to the show today to talk about her nanoscience research, which includes discoveries in microplastics and nanoplastics, surprising new roles minerals play in recycling phosphorus, and how soil bacteria breathe out more CO2 when feeding on certain plant materials.
We will also dive into why nanoscience plays a key role in her research group's activities and her thoughts on the nanoscape now and in the future. So welcome, Ludmilla.
Thank you so much for having me.
We would love to get to know you a little bit more. I know that you grew up in Haiti. Can you tell me about that? And did your childhood have some impact on what it is that you're doing today in the sciences?
So, yes, I grew up in Haiti. I actually moved to New York City when I was in my early teens. Both of my parents were educators, so not college level, but my mother was a kindergarten teacher, and then my father was what the equivalent in the French system would be middle school, elementary school here in the US. I was good in math and science, but as a kid, you don't know what that actually means in terms of a career. My father was also a farmer. Actually, he grew up as a farm boy, my father, and he continued it throughout his life. And so I was always intrigued, how does a soil actually help plants grow? How can you start from a seed and then you end up with a tree? Or you end up with a crop that feeds
a whole
people.
field of crops.
Yes, exactly. It's always, I think as a little girl, it was always intriguing to me, just something that's just in the back of my mind. And I remember specifically, I was about maybe 11 or so. I went on a reforestation trip in the mountains of Port-au-Prince, which is the capital of Haiti. This was my last 2-3 years in Haiti. And that trip was pivotal for me because it really kind of signaled the importance of trees, because we planted about on that trip 500 trees as a group of students. And then before we started to plant the trees, they had kind of an introduction of why we're doing this. And one of the things they said is because we have so much soil erosion. And so we needed to plant these trees in the mountains to kind of hold on to the soil because of the rain that we get in Haiti, because we're a tropical island. And so for me, it was the first time that I started to think of soil, not just in terms of plants, but also in terms of the soil properties, physically, its whole physically. So this kind of got my interest in doing environmental issues in general. And of course, I was too young to think about environmental science, environmental engineering, or anything like that. That came much later, but that's where it started to get an interest in environmental as a field.
Do you do a lot of gardening now, or is it kind of you leave the office, I'm out.
The funny
I don't want to
thing
deal with
is,
any plants anymore.
It's so funny. So many people, I travel so much that I don't have enough time to take care of my own plants. So the only thing I have that's plant-like my home right now it needs to be something that is the least in need of nutrients, the least demanding plant that you can have. That's what I have. It actually is not even green. It's purple. Because I don't know if people know this, because plants that are green actually require more nutrients. I just spent 5 weeks in Europe. So I come back, it's still alive and doing its thing. So this
Amazing.
is what I do, but it's just so funny because I can tell you the entire soil chemistry and what plants need to grow. But I cannot grow plants in my own home.
She's too busy. Yes.
So you also have a background in the fine arts. You were a painter and a photographer.
Yes.
How did that artistic side influence your approach to this complex environmental research problems?
The thing I like about art, you don't have to explain it, right? So I can do my art and then I evoke an emotion in you. Right? So you experience it. It's your own experience because you bring your own kind of personal views, your own personal traumas, your own personal experiences, your own perspectives of the world into my art, and you can experience it and you leave with your own experience. When I think about my art and my science, I can say, okay, it's not directly related, but I'm the same person, right? So it is, I feel very creative in the science that I do.
Mm.
And you can see my science and you can leave with it, kind of the part in it that informs you. So I like to think of it that way in terms of the creation. I think you've seen a lot of the news coverage that Northwestern does on my work. I do the sketches and then
Wow.
because I don't have the time to do the illustration myself. So I do the sketches and I give it to an illustrator to materialize it, how I want to present the research. So in terms of conveying it to the public, I
Yeah.
think that's where it becomes you see my art more tangibly, but I'm very much an artist in everything that I do.
I,
Yeah.
I would love an original Ludmilla for my office
Yes.
whenever we get a chance.
I really originally thought I would be an artist. I just fell in love with chemistry. And when I moved to the States, I had an amazing chemistry teacher actually from Jamaica in New York City. And then I just fell in love with chemistry.
As you said, you fell in love with science. You came here to Northwestern eventually, and your research has been making some headlines lately. And one of the things that people love to talk about is this research with bacteria found
Yeah.
in wastewater that eats plastic. Tell us about this. I mean, some people are like, it's an all you can eat buffet, this bacteria on plastic. I mean, those were some of the headlines that I read. Tell me about this particular work.
It's amazing how much coverage this work has gotten. Because I think in my lab in general, we get excited about understanding what happens naturally. So a lot of this work, I mean, kind of the common thread in all my research are the natural processes that are happening in the environment that could potentially either give us clues for sustainable solutions or give us new avenues or new ways to think about engineering new strategies. But at the core of what we do is understanding natural processes. We're not actually doing any manipulations actually in my lab. We're trying to answer questions that are derived from observations in a natural system or in an engineered system. So this particular work actually was the work that stemmed from one of my first two PhD students. And we really wanted to understand what is the pathway used by bacteria in the environment that can actually metabolize different carbon waste. And that can be plastics, that can be plant waste, that can be other types of the waste that potentially we can use as a way to make chemicals instead of using petroleum. We can use these carbon waste. So it's essentially is to decrease our dependence on petroleum. That's the motivation. So if you walk through a forest, you can see these bacteria, these microbes actually acting on a dead, like a branch, on the soil, degrading over time. It happens very slowly, but it's a very complex material that gets degraded. And so these complex materials have similarities in terms of their structures also with plastics. And so these bacteria that you find in soils that can actually degrade, let's say, a branch that might take years to do, and they can degrade a piece of leaf faster, of course, but the same, they can use their biochemical pathways to also degrade plastics, also very slowly, but they can do it. And so we have been working on understanding these types of soil bacteria and what they do. And this particular study was on Komomonas, which is a type of bacteria that exists everywhere. It's even found in Arctic soils as well. It's everywhere. It's also found a lot in wastewater. At the same time, there's been a lot of observations that people found plastic debris that are in just plastic waste particles that are suspended in urban rivers, for example. So like in a city, a river that flows to a city, they will find these bacteria again and again that are enriched on this plastic material. So then we see an observation and then we want to know why or how it's happening. So I like to tell people my lab is all about understanding the how and why of processes in the environment that can teach us how to do sustainable engineering. And so once we see that, then we were interested. And so that's how we started looking into this particular bacteria because it's observed all the time. So then the natural question is, if it's always found on these plastic particles, does it mean that it's using it as food, or does it mean that it's because it can degrade it? Is it because it can survive on it? It could also mean that it's partnering with somebody else. It could mean that it's not doing anything. It's just that it just so happened that its neighbor can use it. Its microbial neighbor can use it, and then they're depending on that, right? So then we started working on it. And the first study that we did that also got coverage, but not as much as the latest one.
Yes.
The first study as we did, we said, oh, can it just use products from this plastic. So that's the first thing that was published back in 2023 in Nature Chemical Biology. So that was the first study. And we realized it can actually use very simple structures that can come from this plastic. Okay, that's good. It can use that. We elucidated the biochemical pathway for that. And the latest study, the one that people say, all you can eat buffet, was a follow-up study to say, well, if they can use just byproducts from this plastic, can they actually use the plastic material itself? And then that's what we did the study. And the thing I think that really got so much coverage is that we discovered not just the fact I can do it, but we discovered how it's doing it. And we were able to identify the enzyme, the machinery that's actually being used by the bacterium to actually do it. And they're using it as a source of food. There's no other carbon, so we can give it just that plastic material and it's growing on it. But to use that for solutions, because you're like, oh, can we just use this to kind of solve
Coat it all over the plastic,
just
right?
paint it
yeah,
all.
to
Yeah.
solve our plastic problem. What I like to highlight to people that giving this, you see how big we are? We cannot even see bacteria. That's how small they are. So if my bacteria are growing on something for food, they only need a minuscule amount of that food to grow. I mean, they're using it. They're not doing it for us. They're using it for themselves, right? So they're not doing it at the magnitude of like society's need. However, it tells us that they possess the machinery and they have things that we can potentially leverage to the plastic problem. Works needs to be done. Subsequent works need to be done.
Before your study, though, the assumption was really that these nanoplastics enter the wastewater treatment plants as nanoplastics, but your work is now showing that these nanoplastics can actually be formed during the wastewater treatment through this microbial activity. So what was the reaction to that part of the finding?
The reason we wanted to highlight that, because I think it's important to know that there's an entire spectrum to the fate of plastics, right? You start with a very complex material, your plastic bottle, your plastic bags, and that get degraded consecutively by different processes. And one of the things that you get before you get to something that microbe can use as food, you have to turn into microplastics first. Then you turn that microplastics into nanoplastics. Then that nanoplastics turns into really smaller fragments, and then you have the molecular, like now you have the compound that can be used at the end. And so we wanted to kind of highlight the fact that there are microbial activities, at least we show by this bacterium, that can turn microplastics into nanoplastics. And you can think about it twofold. You can think of wastewater being a potential source for nanoplastics. So obviously that's of concern. You can also think of potentially that wastewater can do one of the processes towards doing the next step to turn the nanoplastics into something that we can use, right? So they are twofold in the way that you're looking at this. You know, a lot of time we think nanoplastics are generated in the environment as part of the environmental process. And to say that in addition to that, you can have microplastics that are turning into nanoplastics being generated from the wastewater, we should also look into that as well. So I think there is now interest in trying to follow this as a source of not just microplastics. We already know wastewater is a source of microplastics, right? Because we have microplastics that go through our waste system anyway. It's just saying that it could also get it to be the tinier, the smaller version of the plastics as well.
And again, why does the nanoscale matter so much when it comes to understanding plastic pollution and its impact?
So the nanoscale is very important because the nanoscale version of the plastic material is more accessible for the microbes. Now, if you think about organisms that are higher in the food chain, it's also more bioavailable. So then there's a concern about that in terms of ecosystem health, right? So the nanoscale is the thing that can lodge into like inside of like the fish or invertebrates that are lower in the food chain. So they can also take that. But I just want to keep in mind, it's not just wastewater that is providing nanoplastics being generated. It's part of what happens to plastics in the process of being degraded in the environment. Nanoplastic is one of the steps it has to go through. And the hope is that you have microbes there that can also act on that and use it as a source of carbon.
So, we've been talking a lot about plastics, but
Yes.
your lab also works on other big environmental questions.
Yes.
So, like how soils store and release carbon and how plants get the nutrients that they need. Tell us about your study that found that soil bacteria give off about 3 times more carbon dioxide when they break down lignin, which is the tough stuff that makes wood, and compared to when they break down sugars. Why is that difference such a big deal for understanding how our soils affect climate change?
Yes. So I'll step back and give a little bit of a preface of where that study started. So, one of the huge interests we have as a society is to be able to model what's going to happen in the future. That's the way we do forecasting, right? I mean, we live on forecasting. What's the weather? And so, the way you do forecasting is by modeling, is by understanding kind of the phenomenon, like you observe what has happened in the past, and then you know the weather patterns, you know to predict what will happen, and then you make predictions from that. And so, in the context of carbon dioxide in the environment, there's a lot of course, interest to be able to forecast what's going to happen in terms of what is the carbon dioxide budget, what is actually contributing to the carbon dioxide. And one of the main contributors to the carbon dioxide beyond just humans is soil, just efflux of carbon dioxide from the soil from bacterial microbial respiration of organic matter decomposition in soils, in wetlands, and so on. And that efflux or that production of carbon dioxide and methane is actually 7 times more than what you get from cars. However, that's part of the natural process. The reason we're worried so much about what we add as humans is because what we do is not part of the natural process. So, what happened from soil gets balanced by the ocean also absorbing carbon dioxide. So, there is a cycle that goes on. And then we add an extra thing in the cycle. That's why we get accumulation of carbon dioxide. So, just to go back, we need to have very good modeling. And one of the ways we want to understand, because microbes are so important because they're big budget, right? And then with climate change and forecasting of what's going to happen, we know that's going to affect soil, and we know by inference it's going to affect the carbon dioxide budget. And because of that, we really want to understand how can we connect microbial activity to organic matter chemistry. So if we know the type of microbes that you have from a small ecosystem to larger ecosystem scale, then we can have good predictions. And one of the ways that people have a major number that people, or major parameter that people have used in doing this forecasting is to predict to what extent the microbes are going to take an organic matter and invest it into making biomass. So that means that the carbon is sequestered, or to what extent it's going to respire it into CO2, into carbon dioxide. So then that means that now you have efflux of CO2. Derivation of that parameter is very important. And so there's been a lot of hypotheses on how to derive that parameter. And people have used chemistry to actually predict what this parameter is. So you just have basically it's a variable that you put in a model that says this is what's going to happen. Then it turns out the hypothesis that people had could not be really proven. People have done a lot of studies and they realized actually the chemistry alone is not explaining it. So then people started to propose perhaps it has to do with the biochemistry, not just the chemistry of the organics, but also the biology, the metabolism, to be more specific, the metabolism of the microbes. And this is where we come in because that's our expertise. We do environmental biochemistry. And of course, we understand the environmental chemistry quite well. So we started to investigate, is it possible that the chemistry of the organic matter, which dictates how it's going to be processed in the metabolism, actually dictates how much CO2 you get out of it, how much carbon dioxide you get out of it. And the reason that we made the connection is because not all metabolic pathways are created equal. So some metabolic pathways actually generate more CO2 than other metabolic pathways. So in this work, we decided let's look at sugars because sugars are everywhere in the environment, carbohydrates, they're everywhere. And then we say let's look at a more complex like lignin, which is the toughy part of biomass or plant waste is one of the major sources of carbon for microbial degradation. And so we decided to look at those two types of organic matter and then track where do they go inside of a soil bacterium. And then from that connect how much carbon dioxide that comes out. And what we realize, actually, most of the work has been done on sugars because, yes, a lot of the work has been done on sugars, mostly glucose. But what we realize is that actually, when people do work on sugars, a much higher fraction of the sugar actually end up in the plant biomass. In other words, does not end up in the carbon dioxide. But the lignin, because of the metabolic pathway that's invested into processing, basically digesting the lignin, that pathway has so much more carbon dioxide coming out of that pathway than the pathway that processes the sugar. So completely independently, we were able to actually identify that the pathways alone can give you the prediction. So metabolism is actually at the core of why certain organic matter produces a lot more CO2 than other organic matter based on how they are processed within the microbial metabolism, not just because of its chemistry, but also because of the biochemistry. So biology and chemistry in tandem to give you better predictions of what will happen to organic matter metabolism.
You also discovered that certain minerals in soil, ones containing iron, can help recycle phosphorus, an essential nutrient for plants. Tell me about the significance of this finding and how the IIN helped support you with this work.
Yes, I'm so excited about this work. I'm so excited about it because a lot of the other things that I mentioned are following up from other things, like other groups have done. And this research was like at the core was an idea that I had, and then it just comes out. We were able to prove it, which is kind of exciting.
Very.
So phosphorus first. Why is phosphorus so important? Let's start there. Our bones are made of phosphorus minerals. Our teeth are made of phosphorus minerals. Phosphorus is in DNA. The whole backbone of DNA is made of phosphorus. Phosphorus is in the cell membrane. So if you think of every living system on Earth requires phosphorus. If you think of all the cells of any organism on Earth have their cell membrane have phospholipids, which has phosphorus. And so I like to kind of highlight the importance of phosphorus. Phosphorus is very important for plant growth, which is why we use fertilizers. Fertilizers have nitrogen, which is also important, and also has phosphorus in it. Now, the phosphorus that's in our fertilizers, almost all of it comes from mining. So we mine the phosphorus from reserves in the world. There are probably like 4 major phosphate mines in the world that we get all the phosphorus that we use everywhere that are used to make sure that we can have food security. The problem is when you're mining something is not an unlimited source. So at some point we will run out. So there are multiple predictions. Even in the US, we have our own little tiny phosphorus reserve. Most of the phosphorus comes from China and Morocco and South Africa. But the projection in terms of these minerals, because we are using them, it takes millennia to make a mineral reserve, right? But we're using it in less than 2 centuries, right? So we're using it like 2, 3 centuries so quickly. And so the projection is that we'll run out. Some very conservative projections say that we'll run out in 50 years. Some other projections say we'll run out in 250 years. So somewhere along this line. But we will run out eventually. And so understanding phosphorus and the fate of phosphorus, the recycling of phosphorus, what happens to phosphorus is very important. So I just wanted to give that just for the survival human race. We need phosphorus.
It's important.
The other reason why it's important, the type of phosphorus that plants use is inorganic phosphorus. It's phosphate. Orthophosphate to be more specific. So what is that? The reason I'm highlighting that, the work that we did is organic phosphorus. The difference is the inorganic phosphorus is just phosphate by itself. The organic phosphorus is a phosphate that is locked within an organic compound. So it's linked to an organic compound. So DNA, for example, the phosphorus in DNA is organic phosphorus because it's part of a compound. The phosphorus that you find in phospholipids is actually an organic phosphorus. The phosphorus that you find in your bones and your teeth, because of the minerals, it's inorganic. The type of phosphorus that plants use is inorganic phosphorus. That's the one that we mine. The one that we get from minerals is also inorganic. Now, when microbes and plants are starving for phosphorus, which happens quite often, they can secrete an enzyme that cleaves the phosphorus from an organic source so that they can take the phosphorus. So that process has been thought to be happening only enzymatically, meaning biologically using enzymes. the work that we've done, and I've had this thought because I read a paper back in 2006, 2004, 2005, 2006, around there, that says that some of the process that people are observing in lakes and lake sediment could not be explained only biologically. So that's when I started to have the idea that I think minerals, specifically iron minerals, that are already known to love to bind to phosphate, potentially could be acting as a catalyst. Essentially, can cleave the phosphate from the organic phosphorus, which is why what's being observed in the environment could potentially not be explained solely by biology. That's how this work started. So now you might think, okay, why should we care? If we have a process that's only thought to be biologically. So right now, the same way I was talking about carbon dioxide, so we want to predict what's going to happen to carbon dioxide. We have a whole cycle of the carbon cycle. You've heard about the carbon cycle. The same way we have the phosphorus cycle. Currently, as the phosphorus cycle stands, the only way you can get from organic phosphorus to phosphorus is via biology. So if you have an entire part of the cycle that's missing, then you don't actually know what's happening to the phosphorus. So that's one part of it, understanding really what's happening to the phosphorus. The other part of it is iron minerals are cheap. They're very cheap. So if you can use the iron minerals as a catalyst to recycle phosphorus, because organic phosphorus is everywhere. Your organic wastes have phosphorus in it. So if we can leverage this information, because I'm trying to understand the environmental process and the mechanisms, but if you can leverage this for engineering, then we can recycle organic phosphorus to be used for plants. And so we started this work about 10 years ago. And we got like but the US Department of Agriculture was our first funding to try to understand, is it actually just like the basic of it? Is it actually happening? And then the work that got a lot of coverage is actually we show that it happens in the natural system. We show that it's in sediments in forest soils as well as lake sediments that it's actually happening. And then the grant that we got from INN is the mechanisms. Because it's one thing, because the techniques to use to figure this out is quite complex that I don't have time to get into. It's one thing to show that it's happening, that the minerals can do it, and the minerals are responsible to do it, specifically iron oxide minerals. So these are minerals that have iron and oxygen together, hence the name iron oxide. Minerals that not only can cleave the phosphate, they trap it. So the phosphate stays on the mineral. And so potentially that could be used as a delivery for microbes or potentially for plants. So the part that we're trying to understand, we know it cleaves it, but what are the mechanisms? What exactly is happening on the surface of the minerals? If we can understand that, then we can design a mineral that can replicate this. Because it's one thing to say it happens, but we need to know at the molecular level, how exactly is it happening so that we can design it. So the specific grant that we got is to understand that mechanism, with the goal of having a sustainable nanoscale catalyst that can potentially be used for phosphorus recycling.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how far away do you think you are from having a particle like this?
Yeah, we're doing the mechanisms. We're working, I actually met with my postdoc this morning, and we are working on the first paper to get at the mechanisms, and he's awesome. We've done some really cool work to try to understand kind of at the molecular scale, the chemical reactions and then the actual mechanisms of what's happening and how does a mineral actually catalyze something that if you just put the organic phosphorus, just ribonucleotide, which is a component of DNA, if you put it in water, it's not going to cleave the phosphate by itself. You put it in the enzyme, it does it. You put it with the mineral, it does it. And so then we're trying to say, okay, how does a mineral act like an enzyme, essentially, to cleave this phosphorus? So that's kind of the step. We've already actually figured it out. We're just at the last little piece before we start writing up the manuscript. I would imagine sometime later this year, early next year, we should be submitting this manuscript. We're very grateful for this funding from IIN to really help us to understand this really out of this world phenomenon, right? That could potentially be beneficial for us for plant productivity, agricultural productivity.
Mechanisms of water retention at carbohydrate clay interfaces. What excited me when I read that, the implications of understanding water retention on Mars and other planets. So how do you see this nanoscience contributing to the search for life or beyond Earth?
Yes, that is a very big question that is beyond my expertise. But our interest of this was on Earth, what's happening on Earth
Yes.
first. But it does have implication, what can happen in other planets or meteorites as well. So if we're all amateur gardeners here, we all know that if we have a nice combination of organic matter with the soil, that your soil is more moist. We all know this. We've all experienced this. But do you know that actually why that is? And the mechanisms of that, it's not actually known. Even though it's an
It's common
experiential thing.
knowledge
It's
that,
Yeah,
it's
it's
just
right?
known and we
we
just
Yes,
go
all
with it.
but
know.
we don't know
We
why.
Okay, organic matter is involved somehow,
Yeah.
and we know that organic matter is good. Even if you go to a desert that's super dry, if you have any place have a little bit of organic matter, it's more moist, right? And so that was the subject of my first two PhD students. So one was working on the microbe and plastics, and the other one was working on organic matter and how it traps water on minerals. So that was the subject. And this paper that just came out, because she graduated almost 4 years ago now, this paper that just came out is the last paper of her PhD. And the work that we wanted to understand specifically is we use carbohydrates as an example of organic matter because carbohydrates are everywhere. And so we wanted to know, how does carbohydrate actually trap water? And we had to show that it does lead to that. Even though we experience it, we know it observationally, where we had to measure it and show that the mineral by itself versus the mineral with the organic matter, how much water is actually being trapped. And we do that by actually increasing the temperature and see how much water gets lost. And then we get into the molecular. You can see a common theme. Every research in my lab, we try to understand things at the molecular level because that's how you understand why and how things are happening. And we found that the water actually gets lodged in between the mineral, the chemical interaction is doing with the mineral, and the chemical interaction is doing with the carbohydrate. The water molecules that are lodged between those two entities get trapped. If you don't have the organic matter to also anchor the water, what you have, this water can exchange faster and can leave. And so having that organic matter lodge the water. So why is this important? So if you in other like beyond Earth, of course this is important for us on Earth because it gives you an idea of what's responsible for long-term preservation of water. So you can have soils that go to severe drought, but you can still see just minuscule things of water that still get left behind. You have water that are trapped for millennia, right? In very small nanopores. It's a process, like mineral trapping of water is a process, but to see now how organic matter really increase the binding energy. That's essentially what we discovered, that the energy of the binding of the water really gets increased by almost fivefold when it gets lodged also by the organic matter. Now, there's a lot of interest in how water got on Earth, for example, right? And way before we were here as humans, there's a lot of interest in how water travel, in our solar system, right? Because we know carbohydrates also exist in meteorites. So we know carbohydrates like not just here on Earth. And so what we just found, can it possibly explain lodging or trapping of water that are locked up within kind of mineral nanopores? Also, can this explain potentially, like on Mars, we have this type of mineral. We use clay minerals in the study. This type of clay also exists on Mars. And can possibly this clay and places you have organic matter helps also with some water trapping. So this is where we don't study Mars. We don't study like meteorites. We are studying something on Earth, but can it explain potentially what the kind of the lifetime of water and potentially the persistence of water in certain other non-terrestrial environments?
Something that you keep talking or coming back to is, you're looking to nature to try
Yes.
to understand and engineer sustainable solutions. Talk to me about that.
Just to go full circle, I grew up in Haiti. I grew up in a tropical island. I grew up kind of in nature, and I'm very inspired by things in nature. That's kind of what my interest in science started. Also, I think nature can teach us so much. I'm of the thought that it is worthwhile to really see how microbes in nature do the natural bioengineering. It is worthwhile to look at how minerals in nature do the natural catalysis. And then we can leverage that to potentially teach us new innovations for sustainability. That's what motivates us in my research lab.
What is it about nanotechnology and nanoscience that inspires you and makes you want to keep learning more?
I like to think of the nanoscale and the molecular scale. That scale is what tells us how things are happening. You cannot understand how things are happening and the mechanisms through which they are happening until you get to that scale. So that's the importance of that scale. You cannot get away from it if you want to understand how things work. You need to understand the mechanics of a machine. If you have a machine that's doing a function or operation that's very important to you, and that machine breaks down, you have no way to fix it unless you know how it works, unless you know the mechanics. You cannot see the mechanics or know the mechanics by just looking at it. You have to tear it apart. You have to break it apart into its pieces and see how the pieces fit together. So that's where the nanoscale and the molecular scale is how the different little pieces of the machinery actually come together to eventually give you a function or to operate in a particular way. And so for me, it's exciting to really go to that scale and understanding what's happening, and thus understanding the mechanisms of what makes soil be able to trap water. And I go to that nanoscale and molecular scale to understand that water molecules get trapped by organic matter at the surface of minerals at that molecular scale. Then now I know why I'm observing what I'm observing at the much larger scale. How do microbes use plastics as a source of food? Then I have to go down to the molecular, to the nanoscale of how the enzymes, that are secreted by the microbes, get into the plastics and cleave it and turn it into food. We also are in an era now that we have instruments that can allow that scale to be accessible to us as well. So I think it's just very exciting to be in this kind of era of science.
Well, thank you, Ludmilla, so much for coming to join us. It was phenomenal getting a chance to meet you. We loved having you on the Nanoscape podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for listening. This podcast is brought to you by the International Institute for Nanotechnology at Northwestern University. Be sure to follow this show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to give us a 5-star review.
For more information about IIN, go to our website, iinano.org/podcast.